Hi everyone, I'm Miranda and welcome to a new video. Today I'm really looking forward to sharing some of my top spring book recommendations with you. For this video I've divided them up into categories to a certain extent. So I've got some coming of age stories that I want to share, some books related to gardens and gardeners, and also some books that might encourage you to go out and have an adventure this spring. So the categories reflect themes that I think are particularly appropriate to spring, and I hope you'll find that this video inspires some spring reading for you. So let's get started with my first category, which is coming of age stories. And the first one I have to recommend is I Capture the Castle by Dodie Smith. This is such a great read. It starts in March and then progresses through spring and other seasons as well. But it's a wonderful example of a coming of age story. It's about a young girl called Cassandra who chronicles the eccentric life of her family in a notebook. She's a want-to-be author, and she tells the story of her father, her stepmother, and her sister Rose. Rose is a real beauty, and because the family are living in a crumbling mansion with no money, they're hoping that Rose will solve future problems for them and marry someone with money. So when two wealthy American men arrive on the scene, things get a little bit more complicated. This book is very much a novel about first love and a young girl growing into womanhood. It's very funny. There are some really wonderful bits of humour in this book, and it's one I'm really looking forward to discussing with the Seasons of Story book club in April. So this is one that I'll be rereading this spring. And I have to say too that the Audible version, the audiobook read by Jenny Agutter, is really outstanding and such a favourite of mine. So yes, I'm looking forward to reading this spring myself. And then another huge coming of age favourite for me is The Pursuit of Love by Nancy Mitford. I do think spring just fits this theme of growing up, moving from being a young girl into womanhood, experiencing first love. And that's what The Pursuit of Love is really about. It's about youth and first loves. Part of it is set in Paris as well. And of course, I always think of April in Paris as a wonderful spring theme too. So really this book just ticks so many boxes. And if you've been enjoying some of the books we've been reading together, like The Lost Art of Keeping Secrets, which was the Comfort Book Club read in February, that was a real coming of age story. I Capture the Castle, another coming of age story. The Pursuit of Love would be a great one to read alongside of these books in this theme as well. So I wanted to highlight this one, a real classic by Nancy Mitford. Now, if you've already read and love The Pursuit of Love by Nancy Mitford, then you absolutely must read Darling by India Knight. This is a modern retelling of The Pursuit of Love, and it's just so well done. I honestly cannot praise this book highly enough. I don't know how India Knight did it, but somehow she managed to keep the essential ingredients that make The Pursuit of Love such an extraordinary book, but she still really successfully updated it for the modern age. And I love it, I think, just as much as The Pursuit of Love. It really is written by someone who adores Nancy Mitford's original work. You can just tell that. It really is a love letter to The Pursuit of Love, but it's a wonderful work in its own right as well. And I just love it. So I so recommend it. If you're a fan of Nancy Mitford, you absolutely have to read this. It's definitely been written by another fan, and she's done full justice to the original work. So I so enjoyed this and really recommend this as a great coming of age novel for the springtime as well. And then another book that has a real motif of spring and the idea of young love, but also renewal and hope that I think are such themes of the springtime. They really come up in The Deepening Stream by Dorothy Canfield Fisher. Significantly, at the beginning of this book, it's about the young heroine's memory of observing a tulip growing. And I think this really sets this motif of springtime that recurs throughout this novel. It's a great coming of age story as well, but it's also a lot more than that. I mean, you can see this is quite a chunky book, but I so recommend it. Like I said, this is a coming of age story, but it's also a lot more than that. And it's about a young girl who has quite a troubled childhood in many ways. And she's disturbed by the marriage that she witnesses of her parents. But she does marry herself, and through that marriage, in fact, comes to believe in love. She marries a young Quaker man and adopts many of his beliefs. And in a way, the book could have stopped there. It would have been just this lovely coming of age story. But then it continues and becomes an even more remarkable story because it goes into World War One. And although as Quakers, they are pacifists, they decide to go to France where they have some ties and friends, and to help and support as much as they possibly can during the war, by helping on the ambulance runs, for instance, and things like that. So this book is a real coming of age story, and then it sort of is almost like another book that's this incredible example of what it was like to be in France during the First World War. Ultimately, though, it's a book about hope and what hope means and how you can hold on to hope even in the darkest times. And I think it's that sense of renewal and life going forward and hope that is still so strong in this book that makes it a really good read for the springtime. So another one I really recommend. So just before I move on to the next book, I wanted to say that I have a new Serious Readers offer code to share with you today. Serious Readers are very kindly sponsoring today's video. As I'm sure many of you know, I'm a huge fan of their reading lights. I have their high definition floor light. I've been using this for well over a year now and I absolutely love it. It's made such a difference to my reading life. So I'm really pleased to have a new offer code to share. My offer code is SR511, and if you use that code then you can get £100 off any of the high definition lights as well as free UK shipping. Even though we're now into March and spring is just around the corner, I'm still using my reading light so much. The evenings are still dark, and also I'm trying to impose a no screens habit on myself in the evenings. This means that I'm writing out in rough book reviews and things like that a lot more because I'm trying to get off my laptop as much as possible in the evenings. I find it makes such a difference to my sleeping habits and even to my levels of anxiety if I just get off my laptop and phone in the evenings. So I've really taken to journaling and writing out book reviews sort of in rough and things like that. And this means having a really good light is even more important. I have the high definition cordless floor light, and I really like this one because I can just pick up the light and move it around. So if I'm journaling upstairs in my bedroom in the evenings, for instance, I can carry the light up there, which is so handy because as we live in a really old house, my bedroom doesn't have any overhead lights and there aren't very many sockets to plug lights into up there either. So if I'm sitting at my table by the window and I'm journaling, I can have this light right by me, and that really helps. Also, if I'm reading downstairs in the evening, which I so often am, I can have this light by any chair that I want in the living room downstairs. So like I said, it has made such a difference to my life, and I absolutely love having such a great reading light. I also appreciate that I can adjust the width of the beam of the light as well as the brightness levels, so I can get just the right amount of light for me. And what really makes the high definition lights special is their use of daylight wavelength technology, which replicates the daylight spectrum as closely as possible. And that makes you feel like you're reading in a pool of natural light. And I love that. I find it really helps to decrease eye strain for me as well. And that's really important for me as I have terrible eyesight already. I don't want it getting any worse. So if you'd like a really good reading light as well, then do take advantage of my new offer code. Again, that is SR511. Using that offer code will get you £100 off any of the high definition lights, as well as free UK shipping. I'll put all of the details in the video description box down below, so you can check out the link and the Serious Readers lights for yourself. But now let's get back to my spring books. Okay, so now let's move on to my next category, which is having adventures in the springtime. And one of my absolute favourites for this is The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. So I absolutely adore the start of this book when Mole gets tired of spring cleaning. He senses spring outside and even moving in the earth around his home, and he says, "Hang spring cleaning," and he decides to head off and have adventures, which of course he does, and he meets some very important new friends. So The Wind in the Willows is one of the books that I always love to pick up in the springtime, even though there are wonderful descriptions of all of the seasons in this book. I just always like to pick it up at this time of year. I am in full sympathy with Mole. I would much rather go out and explore the world outside than do a lot of spring cleaning at this time of year, and I think a lot of us can sympathise with Mole. And it's just such a lovely description of spring at the start of this book, so this will always be a favourite of mine. Then another wonderful adventure story that begins in the springtime is The Little Grey Men by Bebe. I have the slightly foxed edition here, which has been so beautifully done. And this is just the kind of book, if you love The Wind in the Willows, if you love The Hobbit, then I would definitely recommend giving this a try. This is about some gnomes who live in a wood, and one of their friends has become lost, and they decide one springtime that they really must brave the river and go and seek him. Thus begins a whole series of adventures for them, and it's just such a sweet story, and it has such wonderful descriptions of the natural world. That's such a part of the book that I love so much, and it makes it a wonderful read for adults just as much as children. Again, it actually goes on to describe different seasons so well. There are some lovely autumn descriptions in this book too, but it's that beginning of the springtime and this sense of adventure that I really love about the book, and it always makes me want to pick it up at this time of year. Now, one of my absolute favourite spring reads is of course The Enchanted April by Elizabeth von Arnim. And this is about a group of mainly middle-aged women who are discontented in some ways with their lives, and they're captured by an advert seen in the newspaper for a small Italian castle that is available to rent in April. And these women, who are for the most part strangers to each other, but they club together in order to be able to afford to rent this castle, and they go off to Italy in the springtime, and this trip just changes their lives. One of my absolute favourite books, and it's one that I love returning to in the springtime. Again, there's a really good audiobook available of this. I'll link my favorite in the description box with all of the other books so you can check it out, because something I always love to do is I don't always physically read a favorite book, but I do love to listen to it again on audio. So that's something that I really like to do with Enchanted April, and there's a really wonderful audiobook available of this one. And then if you like the Enchanted April, then Ayan Spring by Anne Bridge is in many ways a great companion read. Again, this is about a middle-aged woman who is dissatisfied with her marriage and with her life, and she decides to escape her family and go off and travel abroad. And there she really finds herself. This is a book very much about creativity and freedom. It's about young love as well as middle-aged love. And it just is another excellent read, especially for the spring, and especially if you have a sense of wanting a bit of adventure in this season, then this is absolutely a book to try. So continuing the theme of adventures abroad, I wanted to suggest Paris, My Sweet by Amy Thomas. This is such a fun memoir, and with this choice I'm really thinking of the April in Paris spring theme for the springtime too. This is about a young American woman who moves to Paris for the year because of her work, and it's about her experiences in the city of love. Now, she has a real sweet tooth, just like I do, and loves to explore the cities that she lives in. So there are wonderful descriptions of New York, where she's from, as well as Paris in this book. And she explores the cities through the sort of cakes and patisserie on offer. Who wouldn't want to do that? So I love this book because it's a real ode to the City of Light, but it also is a love letter to France and to French food, but also to her hometown of New York as well. And she learns to appreciate that city in some ways from moving away from it. Amy Thomas wrote another book later about Brooklyn, and I really enjoyed reading that too. But for the springtime, I think it has to be one set in Paris that I recommend. And then in the spring, if you're inspired to head out a bit more, maybe go on some bike rides again, then I think this book is so inspirational. One More Croissant for the Road by Felicity Clark. And this is another memoir, a real foodie memoir again, about Felicity biking around France and trying so many of the amazing regional dishes of France. I think this would inspire so many of us to get on a bike, even me, and go off and try and find the best croissant that there is. That sounds like the kind of adventure I could definitely get behind in the springtime. So this is a lovely read. And then if you want to take to the hills but on your own 2 feet rather than a bike, this book is quite inspirational as well, and that's Windswept by Annabel Abbs, Walking in the Footsteps of Remarkable Women. This is a really interesting group biography. It's about women who have been attracted to the wilderness, whether that's the desert of America, in the footsteps of Georgia O'Keeffe, or the high hills of Scotland, following the example of Nan Shepherd. Annabel Abbs examines some of these women in this book, and she writes about how their creativity is in some ways connected with the land and really getting out and exploring the land. So another great book to inspire a bit of adventure this springtime. And then thinking a bit more about the countryside and how this has inspired creativity and a sense of freedom for many women. This is a new group biography that I was just recently sent by Penguin Press, and it sounds so interesting. It's called Rural Hours, The Country Lives of Virginia Woolf, Sylvia Townsend Warner and Rosamond Lehman by Harriet Baker. Again, this is another group biography that really explores how the countryside helped these women at a time when they had a lot of anxiety about their creative work. I'm really looking forward to reading this one, and I think it will be a great springtime read as the countryside around me is really wakening up again, and I can't wait to get out and explore it a bit more. And then another book that I also just recently picked up and I'm looking forward to reading this spring is All Before Me, A Search for Belonging in Wordsworth's Lake District by Esther Rutter. Well, for one thing, I do always think of both William and Dorothy Wordsworth in the springtime because I think of that famous poem about daffodils by William Wordsworth, but I also think about his sister Dorothy's diaries and her descriptions of finding this amazing sort of grove of daffodils with her brother and how inspiring they both found this scene. So of course I think of the Wordsworths because of that reason in the springtime, but I also love to go to the Lake District. We're not too far away. We've travelled there in the spring and it's just so idyllic at this time of year. I'm hoping to go back this spring. And again, this is an interesting memoir about sort of the healing powers of the countryside and of place. I've really liked the work of Esther Rutter before, so I'm looking forward to reading this memoir, which is all about how she suffered a breakdown in her early 20s in Japan, moved back to England, ended up getting a job at Wordsworth's house in the Lake District, and how I believe she found this process and her new work and her new place sort of healing and inspiring. So I'm looking forward to reading this, and I'm sure it will inspire me to go on an adventure and get off to the Lake District sometime this season. So for my final category, I wanted to talk about books for people who love gardens and gardening. The first one that I want to recommend is Elizabeth and Her German Garden by Elizabeth von Arnim. This is such a favourite of mine, and if you love The Enchanted April but you haven't read this yet, then you absolutely must. Elizabeth von Arnim herself absolutely loved gardens, and she found being in nature really inspiring for her own creative work. It really mattered to her. And this is quite an autobiographical account of growing her garden and how much it meant to her. So absolutely one to read if you've never read it before. And then this book is about a gardener just as much as it is about a garden, and it's Old Herbaceous by Reginald Arkell. I love this book. It's such a sweet, charming story, and it's about a gardener. It follows him from the spring of his life as a young gardener's boy through to the winter of his life as an old man. The book was actually written, I believe, when Reginald Arkell was himself in his 70s. So it does have that feeling of being quite a reflective book of an older man looking back through the years. And this covers quite an incredible lifespan of a gardener who is working in the garden of a big country house, and his lifetime covers both world wars, so he witnesses many changes to the world around him. It's also a book that's really about friendship, and I love that. It's also about what it means to have dignity in your old age and how important that is. But of course, it's also such an ode to gardens. And if you haven't read this one, then again, I so recommend it. Now, a real favourite of mine is The Darling Buds of May by H.E. Bates. Set in Kent, which is so often referred to as the Garden of England, and this book has some wonderful descriptions of the springtime. It's also such a wonderful comfort read. It's so funny and is a huge favourite of mine. Then another great favourite is Anne of Green Gables. This isn't strictly about gardens, but I've kind of included it in this category because I just love the way that Ellen Montgomery writes about nature. Avonlea feels like a whole garden in its own right that Anne gets to explore in this book. I always remember it as starting sometime in April. In fact, it begins in June, but obviously in this part of Canada, spring comes a little bit later than it does in the UK, for instance, because in June, that's still when blossom is happening, and it really has a lot of the spring flowers that we would associate more with April, for instance. So it really does start in the blossoming world at the beginning of this book, and it's just such a favourite of mine. I'm really looking forward to reading this with the Comfort Book Club in April. Then, of course, March's choice for the Comfort Book Club is The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett, one of the most famous books about a garden that there is, and I can't wait to read this one with everyone who's reading along with the Comfort Book Club this month. I'm really looking forward to discussing it. Now, another favourite of mine is Life in the Garden by Penelope Lively. This is a non-fiction book, and it's a really delightful read. It's a memoir, but Penelope Lively also examines some gardens in fiction that have meant a lot to her. So it covers the gardens of her own life. She is a writer who is also a real gardener, really passionate about gardening. If you're a gardener too, then I think you would really enjoy this. But even if you just love, like I do, reading about gardens and gardens in literature, then you would really enjoy this book as well. Moving on to some more sort of anthologies. I love this little anthology of garden stories. This is a collection of excerpts and short stories related to gardens. And this is the type of book that's lovely to have on your bedside table in the springtime, so you can just dip in and out of it in the evenings. Another book like that, perfect for your bedside table, is A Nature Poem for Every Spring Evening, edited by Jane McMorland Hunter. I love Jane's anthologies. I know a lot of you really like them too, and some of you will recognise Jane as a contributor to Seasons of Story, because besides being a bookseller and an author, she's also a great cook, and she shares some recipes with us. But I do really like her poetry anthologies so much too, and this is a lovely one to have just to dip into on spring evenings throughout this season. Now, this is such a fun little book, Rhubarb, Rhubarb, a correspondence between a hopeless cook and a hopeless gardener and a hopeful cook. This is about two friends. One is a trained chef and another is, I think, an award-winning garden designer or something like that, very good gardener. And they each would like to be better at the other's skill. So this is really an exchange of letters between the two friends, sharing tips on gardening, for instance, or sharing little recipes. And it just makes such a fun read. And then again, a lovely choice for this time of year when maybe you want to experiment a bit and try something new in the garden or try something new in the kitchen. And you can pick up this book for a bit of inspiration. Then Onward and Upward in the Garden is an anthology of Catherine S. White's writings. She was the wife of E.B. White, and this is such a wonderful book. Again, it's the type of book that's lovely to have on your bedside table, just to pick up, read a little bit of each evening. She writes so well about gardens, and yes, another lovely choice. Then I really also like Gardener's Nightcap by Muriel Stuart, which Persephone Books have republished. I love the idea of this. It's like a little nightcap for gardeners. So the whole idea is you're meant to dip into this book and just read a little bit each evening and enjoy it as a type of literary nightcap. And I think that's such a fun idea. There's some nice little illustrations in it as well, which Persephone have included, which is very nice. So there are a few little illustrations, which I always like in books. And again, it's just a fun one to have on your bedside table and get to dip in and out of. Then this is a fairly recent addition to my shelves, 12 Words for Moss by Elizabeth Jane Burnett. And I love how this book captures some of the magic and mystery of the countryside. Here, Elizabeth Jane Bennet takes 12 names for moss, and they're so unusual. I had no idea. Glowflake, Rocket, Small Skies, Kind Spears, Marilyn. Those are all names for moss, and I just had no idea. I think that's amazing. So this is sort of part memoir, part nature writing, part poetry as well. I love the poems that are included in this book, and just makes a delightful read for the springtime. Then another anthology I really like is the Virago book of Women Gardeners, edited by Deborah Kellaway. Again, this is just such a nice anthology, one that I like to dip in and out of through this season, and will probably inspire some of your further reading as well. That's one thing I like about anthologies so much, is they offer these little tasters of other writers, and then you often want to go off and read more of their work. So this is a really nice anthology, especially obviously if you love gardens and gardening. And then my final choice is a non-fiction book related to gardeners, and that's An Almost Impossible Thing: The Radical Lives of Britain's Pioneering Women Gardeners by Fiona Davison. It was so hard for women to break into the real male-dominated world of professional gardening, and Fiona Davison looks at this in the lives of some women before World War I who wanted to train to become professional gardeners, and how hard that was, and the sort of ridicule that they faced. Really fascinating, and would be a great non-fiction pick for this season. But anyway, I hope you've enjoyed these recommendations. I hope they may have inspired some of your spring reading. Do let me know what books you think you might be picking up and reading in the springtime if you'd like to do a bit of seasonal reading. I'd love to hear. But thank you so much for watching. Extra big thanks as always to those of you who pressed the super thanks button on my last video. I so appreciate your generosity. But of course, I also appreciate the people who support my work by being part of one of my communities, either Seasons of Story or the Bookish Almanac, or even both. And I also so appreciate those of you who support my videos by watching them, liking them, commenting on them, and of course, subscribing to my channel. You all make such a difference. And I hope you have a wonderful spring ahead. But I'll see you again next week. Goodbye.